Today we're going to be looking at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph in the Bible in Genesis chapter 12 through to 50. This is often called narrative or story. It is important to think when we are preaching or talking, what is a narrative and story? How do we tell it well? How do we read it well? In Abraham's life, in Genesis 12, we read that God calls him to go to the promised land. In Moses' life, the people of Israel are captive in Egypt, and the background at the beginning and setting is slavery and captivity in Egypt, and the main characters are Moses and Israel and Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And then God calls Moses to leave Egypt and go towards the promised land, where he will lead the people towards hope in God. Moses is called the protagonist, the main person who does things, the main character. And Pharaoh is called the antagonist, the one who opposes him. And in your life and mine, there are protagonists like you and I and people who support us. And then there are antagonists, people who for some reason may oppose us because they don't know or because they have different values or different goals. The story or plot line usually revolves around a difficulty or a problem. God calls Moses to leave and go to a promised land, but Pharaoh, the antagonist, says, no, I want you to stay here and be my slaves and servants and make bricks. And there is a problem and a difficulty. And then they leave Egypt and go towards the promised land, and they come to the sea and they have another problem. And then they look back and Pharaoh is chasing after them and they have another problem. But God helps them and opens the waters and makes the way and parts the water, and they move on towards the promised land. And so this is a story, a narrative, or a plot in which a solution or an answer is provided. And it is interesting. When you preach or tell a story, you often tell a testimony or a narrative about your life, or you present a story about something that may have happened, or you read a Bible story. And it may be an eyewitness account, or it may be a story or a testimony. And if we type in narrative theology into Google Scholar or into Google, we will find resources on narrative and theology, such as this resource by the Gospel Coalition that tells us about how there are many narratives and stories in the Bible, and it's helpful to understand these narratives and stories. By definition, a narrative can be true, or it can be a story that's made up, or it can be a bit of both. It can have elements of truth and elements that are made up as well. Bible theology seeks to study these narratives, and a narrative theology seeks to understand the nature of these. And so the Bible presents its narrative as truths revealed by God, which can be truths through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. And these can be truths that are real events, but in the prodigal son or in the Good Samaritan, that could also be a made-up story that has truths. So we can have a true story, and so a story such as the prodigal son could be a true story or a made-up story with truths in it. A true story is called a narrative, whereas a made-up story is often called a story. So that is one of the differences between a narrative, which is usually more true, and a story which contains truths. So using Google Scholar, we can look up resources like John Clausen, Practical Theology and Narratives, in which he says a narrative story approach to theology makes a bridge between interpretation, how we understand what is in the Bible, and the nature of storytelling, the structure of the story, the form of the story. And stories and narratives usually begin with a setting, such as Egypt, where things are, and then there is a crisis or a problem, and then there is an answer. And the plot describes the journey from the setting, crisis or problem, towards the answer. And so if you were to tell the narrative of story of Moses, you would say, Moses is called by God. We begin in Egypt, and Pharaoh says, you shall not leave. But God says, Moses, I'm calling you to a better land, a good place. And Moses says, yes, God, I will tell Pharaoh. And Moses tells Pharaoh, I am leaving. I am taking Israel. I am going to the promised land. And Pharaoh, the antagonist, creates the crisis and problem when he says, no, you are not going, Moses. You will stay here. And Moses prays, God, what shall I do? And God reveals, you shall leave, you shall go to the promised land. And Moses has faith and he steps out and goes to the promised land. And that is the plot of the story, which includes that which is real, Moses leaving Egypt, but there could also be other elements of the story. So a brief overview of narrative in theology shows that it can be useful and practical in that it can help us understand story in our lives. We all tell stories to ourselves and we tell stories to others and in testimony. And sometimes when something goes bad, we tell a bad story. I am sad. I want to plant a church, but they won't let me plant a church. And I am sad. And so that's the beginning of a sad story. And I have an opposition, but I might pray and hear God. And then I become happy because God says he is going to help me. And so then I pray some more and God guides me and I try again. And then they might say, no, you are not going to plant a church. And so I pray again. And then finally they say, this is what will happen and good things will happen. And then we find that good unfolds. And so this is a story that we tell, and we tell it to ourselves. I'm sad, things aren't going well. And then I pray and things become happier. We tell it to others, and we tell it in testimony, and we tell it in prayer to God. And the story can change over time. This story is partly psychological. It's happening in our minds. It is partly sociological. It's happening in relationships with people. It's philosophical. That is, it's about big truths. It's constructed in that I put together the story. Someone has said that people will pay $1 for a story. Sush, what is the money in Nepal? Is it $1?
No, sir. Rupees.
Rupees.
It is rupees, sir. Yeah.
Yes. So I may pay, how many rupees would you pay someone who pays a good story? 1 rupee, 10 rupees?
Or sorry, sir.
If someone told a good story at church and you
Yeah.
gave a donation, how many rupees would you give him?
We won't give anything, sir. We will
Oh, you
just
wouldn't
give
give
some.
anything?
Yeah.
It cannot be a very good story if you wouldn't give anything.
We don't pay anything for
Yes.
story or something else.
Yeah. So you may give a little bit, but if it's a true narrative, someone has said you would give your life for a true narrative, like the narrative of Jesus. We may be willing to die or give our life for a true narrative. So a narrative makes people have extraordinary thoughts and dreams and hopes if it's a good narrative. Narrative theology seeks to understand the stories of God as they are told in stories. Narrative seeks to understand the way of storytelling, how we tell a story. And if you understand narrative well, and if you tell narrative well, then that can help you in many ways. With the narrative that we're looking at today in Genesis 12, it's the narrative of Joseph. And if you turn in your Bibles to Genesis 12, we have a narrative that begins before in Genesis 11, where the Tower of Babel is built, and then people make a world in their image in Babylon, in Babel. And then Abraham's father, Terah, leaves Ur of Chaldees and the big city and journeys. Terah journeys with Abraham and Lot and journeys from Ur of Chaldees, a big city, very fertile, lots of plants, lots of rain, and he journeys towards a new land like Moses does. And then he settles halfway there. He doesn't get to the new promised land of Canaan, and he dies in Haran halfway there. And then in Genesis 12, God speaks to Abraham. You have not yet fully left Ur of Chaldees. You have not fully journeyed towards the promised land that I have promised to give you, like Moses will. Go, leave the old country and go travel with Israel, your people, to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And so this is a story and a narrative and a promise. And you and I may have lived in sin or may have lived in problems, but God calls us to leave and go to the new hope that we have in God. And I will make you a great nation. So God is going to bless those who have faith and obey him. So Abraham went and left and went with his wife and traveled towards the promised land. But a problem arises. There is a famine, there is no food, and Abraham goes down to Egypt and says that Sarah, just my sister, and Pharaoh wants to marry his wife Sarah, and then problems come. So this is a story that has lessons to teach us about faith in God And this is called narrative theology, looking at the story. This is a story of migration, leaving one place and moving towards a new place. Do you know some people who are migrants, who are moving from one place to another? Sush, do you have some people near you who are migrants, moving from one place to another place? Sush?
In context of what, sir?
In your church, in your town, in Kathmandu, in Nepal, are there migrants there?
Yes, sir. They have been migrated from village to city, and
Mm,
some have been gone city to village, and some
mm.
have been come pastor to Japa and pastor to Ilam, pastor to Kathmandu. That happens, sir.
Yes, yes, yes. So Abraham was a migrant, and many people are migrants who are migrating and moving as they hear God calling them. Much of our life can also be like migration, leaving behind the old and going towards the new. Even growing up is like migration. So once you were a child, and then after you are a child, you become perhaps a teenager, and after you're a teenager, you become a young adult, and then you leave that behind and you become an older, mature, responsible adult, and then you become older and wise. Sush, do you use the word child, teenager, young adult, mature, responsible, older, wise? What words do you use in Nepal to describe this journey from young person to middle age to older?
We use baby
Yes,
and child,
yes,
then teenager,
yes,
then adult,
yes,
and then older measure, responsible,
yes.
then older one or elder one.
Yes. Interestingly, we have two different views of the older one. Some people say the older one is not as good as the younger adult, whereas in many societies, they say the older one is very wise. In Nepal, do they call an older person very wise, or do they think that the more thoughtful, wise person is the young adult? Sush, what are your thoughts on that?
Pardon, sir?
Do they give respect to old people in Nepal?
Yes, sir. They respect because the experience they have and
Yes, yes,
the age they have just crossed, so they have bit respect for from each.
yes, yes. And that is so important, and the Bible encourages respect. So notice that there is a type of migration from baby to child to teenager to adult to responsible adult to older, experienced, respected old person. And we see Jesus and Paul talk about the ways in which you should no longer drink milk like a child. You should be responsible and thoughtful like an adult and an older person. There is perhaps a migration that takes place as we respond to the call of God to leave our child ways and become more adult. But there can also be a migration in space where we are called to leave one town and go to another town. And at times like this, it's important to hear the calling of God and to have wisdom and guidance. Can I ask you to write down on a piece of paper when you are migrating from one place to another? So when migrating, traveling. What are 3 things we should do? Can you read this out in Nepali, Sush? So when leaving, traveling, migrating from one place to another, what are 3 things we should do, such as pray, listen to God, read the Bible, talk to people? What are 3 things that we should do? Can you read that out in Nepali, please? And then I'll ask, can you ask people to write that down for themselves and to write it in chat if they can?
ओके सर। यहाँ चाहिँ जब चाहिँ कोही मान्छे अथवा नेपाली होस् जोसुकै होस् कुनै ठाउँमा चाहिँ बसाइसराई गर्नु पर्यो भनेदेखि चाहिँ उनीहरूले चाहिँ 3टा कुरा चाहिँ के गर्नुपर्छ भनेर चाहिँ यहाँ प्रश्न छ। तपाईँहरूले चाहिँ आफ्नो नोट कहीँ लेख्नु होला, सक्नुहुन्छ भनेदेखि त्यस सकेपछि हामीसँग च्याट बक्स छ, यहाँ पनि लेख्न सक्नुहुन्छ। ओके, थ्याङ्क यू सर।
Thank you. So let's take a couple of minutes to write down then things that we would do, like Abraham, if we have a sense that we are called by God to leave one place and go to another, or if we're called by God to grow up and leave behind childish ways and become more mature, or if we're to leave one area and go to another area. What are some things that we could do? And I'm thinking of things like pray, listen to God, Bible, talk to the pastor. These are some things that you might think of that you could do, and you could write some of these in the chat. What stands out to you? What is a good response when you sense God calling you to migrate? People who travel and migrate are sometimes called missionaries, in that they're on a mission, carrying a message to a new place, to a new people. Missionaries on a mission. People who travel could be called apostles or itinerant pastors or bishops. They are called to travel and let people know, like the Apostle Paul, who was a missionary who carried the message. Starting point here for Abraham is that he's called by God to leave his land and go to the promised land that God had revealed and shown to him. The Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household, to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people of the earth will be blessed through you." So thank you, Powell, who has written, "Take knowledge about the place where you are going. Learn language of the place. Take enough money and support and resources." And Sush has written, 3 things I would do. I would pray. I would find suitable direction, place to live. I would carry out the things and know everything about the place. So these are excellent suggestions. And if you've got some suggestions, you could write those in the chat as well. And for Abraham, whose name was Abraham before God changed his name to Abraham, father of nations, heard God and left and went with his brother Lot towards the promised land that God had for him. And then he faced further challenges along the way. In Genesis 13, we see that Abraham faces a challenge when there is a piece of land and his brother Lot needs some land for their cattle and animals, and Abraham also needs some land. And rather than taking the land first, Abraham trusts God and says to Lot, I am gracious and caring, you choose. And Lot chooses the best land. Abraham says, let us not have a quarrel, and let us not have a quarrel between your herders and mine. We are close relatives. There is the whole land before us. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. And Lot saw the whole plain stretching out with lots of water, like a garden, like Eden, like Egypt. And Lot chose the better land, but possibly because it was the better land, there were troubling people, wicked people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And sometimes what looks like the best may have the most troubles, where Abraham went to the rougher mountain area, but there were better people there. And Abraham kept faith with God there. And then Lot got into trouble with the bad people, and Abraham rescued Lot from the bad people. Then Abraham met Melchizedek, and he blessed Abraham and said, blessed be Abraham by God, praise be God, who has delivered you. And one of the main stories in the Bible is that God can deliver us from our enemies as we trust in God. And then in Genesis 15, because Abraham had faith in God, then God called Abraham's faith righteousness, because Abraham trusted in God. Verse 6 of Genesis 15, Abraham believed God. Abraham trusted God. Abraham did good, did the right things because he believed God and trusted God, and this was called righteousness. So Genesis 15. Let me just check now. I'll be back in 1 minute. Can I get you, everyone, to write down what has stood out to you? What has been the most beneficial thing that we have seen in this first lesson today? What did you find most? And if you want to write into the chat, you could write down there what stood out to you. Thank you, Phoebe, for writing, if you were journeying, you would choose a suitable place, facilities, and find out about the environment. And Babu, thank you for writing that you would pray. You would pray for God for that place, and then you would observe from time to time. So thank you for that. Can I get everyone to write down now what has stood out to you and what will continue to stand out while I just check some notes?
के लेख्नु भने हो र दादा?
अहिले क्लासभरि यो फर्स्ट सेसन क्लासमा के कुरा चाहिँ एकदमै तिम्रो दिमागमा छाप पर्यो अथवा तिमीले के कुरा सिक्यौ त्यो चाहिँ लेख न।
In about 5 or 10 minutes, we will have our break, and our break may be a bit longer this time, up to 20 minutes, maybe even up to half an hour. I'll leave things running. The internet will probably cut out because they're going to cut my power off in 10 or 15 minutes, and then they're going to put my power back on a little bit after that. So Genesis 15, Abraham had faith. Genesis 16, we have Hagar and Ishmael and the promises of God to Ishmael. So God blesses all people. Genesis 17, we have circumcision. That is, faith was demonstrated through circumcision. And so there can be different practices. For Christians, it is often baptism. And for others, it can be different practices that show their faith. And so different groups have different practices such as baptism. And then we find in the chapters ahead, the narrative or story continues. In chapter 19, the bad people in Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. Judgment comes, but Lot is saved and preserved. And then we come to Genesis 21. And in Genesis 21, Abraham and Isaac have a child, Isaac. Abraham and Sarah have a child, Isaac. And then one of the most important chapters with Abraham is Genesis 22, when God challenges and tests Abraham and said, "You showed faith when you let Lot have the best land. What will you do now when I ask you to give up your son, the one you love, Isaac? If you are asked by God to take him out and to abandon him or to lay him on the altar, what will you do, Abraham?" And Abraham says, "I will obey. I will have faith. I will trust." And then Abraham takes his son, Isaac, out. And Abraham lays his son, Isaac, down. And verse 9, they reach the place. Abraham builds an altar, puts wood on it, and he binds his son and lays him on the altar. And then he reaches out and takes a knife to slay his son. Here is the problem. Here is the challenge. And Abraham trusts God. And then the angel of God says, "Abraham, do not do it. Do not lay a hand on your son, because I know you do not fear God. You trust God. You have faith. You will even let your son go." And then God provides a ram that Abraham sacrifices on the altar. There are many challenges in interpreting this. Firstly, there is the cultural challenge in that we don't sacrifice in this way today. So there is the culture. And we spoke before about the original setting and the bridge from their time to Jesus to our time. And in that culture, in Abraham's time, they would sacrifice. We don't sacrifice in the same way, though you may sacrifice and give up something. I gave up my job as a school teacher to become a pastor, and so I made a sacrifice. So there can be a sacrifice, but it's a different sacrifice. I also know that Jesus died for me. And so there is another sacrifice, that is the sacrifice of Jesus. And then there is the sacrifice today that I may make as well. And so in the bridge diagram, we see that these are different times and we need to interpret them. And the principle is that God may call you to sacrifice, but for Abraham, it was to sacrifice his son. And so Abraham, his son, And then we have in the time of Jesus, was the sacrifice of Jesus. And then today, what does God call you to sacrifice? Can I get everyone to write down what is something that God calls you to sacrifice? Sush, can you ask them in Nepali? And can you explain that the bridge diagram reminded us there's a difference between the ancient culture and the time of Jesus 1,000 years later and our time 2,000 years later in Nepal, that there is a difference between the cultural sacrifice and the time of Jesus and today. And then I'm asking you, what does God call you to sacrifice? Can you explain that in Nepali to everyone, please, Sush?
ओके सर यो चाहिँ के भनेदेखि सबैभन्दा पहिला चाहिँ कुन तरिकाले चाहिँ बलिदान गर्थे भन्ने अब हुन त सबैलाई थाहा छ होइन इङ्ग्लिस सबैले बुझ्छ तर पनि सरले भनिहालेँ अब म थोरै बोल्दै सुरुमा चाहिँ कसरी चाहिँ होइन बलिदान गर्थ्यो भन्ने कुरा अब जसरी अब्राहमको टाइममा चाहिँ आफ्नो छोरालाई चाहिँ उसले काट्नु नै लागेको छ अथवा जसरी चाहिँ खसीहरू बोकाहरू अथवा बाछाहरू काटिन्थ्यो सेक्रिफाइस गरिन्थ्यो त्यसरी नै अनि पछि येशू ख्रीष्टको टाइममा आएर चाहिँ कसरी सेक्रिफाइस भयो अथवा येशू ख्रीष्टको सेक्रिफाइस चाहिँ कस्तो हो त अथवा कस्तो भन्ने कुरा उहाँ चाहिँ अब आफ्नो शरीरै उहाँले दिनुभएको छ अनि अहिलेको कन्टेक्स्टमा चाहिँ अब हामीले आफ्नो शरीर दिने कुरा त आउँदैन तर अवस्था नआउला भन्न सकिन्न पछिको दिनमा तर के भनेदेखि अहिले चाहिँ वास्तवमा हाम्रो क्रिस्चियन जीवनमा चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ के चाहिँ बलिदान गरेको चाहिँ चाहनुहुन्छ अथवा के चाहिँ हाम्रो जीवनदेखि चाहिँ के चाहिँ बलिदान गर्नुपर्छ कुन कुरा चाहिँ बलिदान गऱ्यो भने परमेश्वर खुसी हुन्छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ लेख्नु पर्यो यहाँ नोटमा के अरे च्याट बक्समा ओके ओके सर डन
Thank you. Thank you. So God is calling you. Thank you, Sush. That was very well explained. So God is calling you at times to be like Abraham and to lay some things down. And I remember in my life, I had an opportunity to pastor a church, and I went to the area to pastor, and then someone else was given an opportunity and they took that role and I laid that down. It was my dream. I wanted to pastor that church. And I came back a bit sad. And then God opened up another opportunity for me. And it was an opportunity to teach and to do a master's degree and then a PhD degree. And God opened up much better. And I think that's what God did for Abraham. He opened up much better. As Phoebe has written, God wants us to sacrifice evil of heart and life and put that aside. Thank you, Phoebe. That's excellent. And Tricia and Babu writes to sacrifice worldly desires. And one of the worldly desires is to become angry or selfish, and we sacrifice that and lay that down. And Susha's written, there can be things in the physical realm, or there can be fear for the future, which we lay down and sacrifice. So these are all important in Genesis 22, where we read about the sacrifice that is made by Abraham. And so the narrative of Abraham's story is then followed by the death of his wife, Sarah, and then Abraham becomes old and his son, Isaac, finds a wife in Rebekah. God provides another story in Genesis 24, and then in Genesis 25, Abraham too passes to the next life, and Isaac and Ishmael and their children are left behind. And so we have the story of Isaac that we read about in these chapters. And then in Genesis 27, we have Isaac and Esau. And here we have an intriguing story where Esau is born first, is the oldest, will inherit all things, but he doesn't value his inheritance and he loses it. And Isaac, who wants the inheritance more, he is the one who pursues it. And so there is quite a story or narrative that is told here about Esau and Isaac. And so Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him, and Esau missed out on the dream that God had, and then Jacob had the dream, and Jacob saw the promises unfolding. And so we can read about this story of Isaac and Esau and Jacob, and Jacob marrying and Jacob having 12 children. And then from Genesis 30 through to 35, we begin to read about the 12 children of Jacob, or Israel, as his name is changed to, and this then becomes known as the 12 tribes of Israel, who descend from the 12 children of Jacob. And so there is a tension between Jacob and Esau, but it is resolved. So there is another tension there. And so you can read about that in chapter 32 through to chapter 35. After the break, when we come back, we will look at the Joseph narrative, which is a very important narrative in Genesis, and that is the Joseph narrative goes from Genesis 37 through. So after the break, which could be a long break, could be up to 20 minutes to half an hour, we will look at the Joseph narrative. And so what I'd like you to do in this next half hour, you can do a bit of revision of what we have talked about with Joseph, but I'd like you to read ahead with Joseph. You might also want to do some reading on the notes that I have provided on narrative, and some of the things that we have talked about, remember, are things like plot. So plot is the sequence of events that make up the story. So God has a plan for good, but there are often problems along the way, and God helps us as we face these difficulties. In a narrative, there are often characters, the main people in the narrative, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and there are protagonists who are the main people, and there are antagonists, the people who oppose them, like Pharaoh, the problem people. At the center of many stories is a conflict, and the conflict may be with the natural world, the conflict may be with the society, it could be with other people, or the conflict may be within when we have fear and don't have faith. And Sush, you noted that this conflict can be within. Sush, do you have any questions about narrative theology? It seems to be a useful way of understanding how we tell stories. I'm interested in the psychology, why we want to tell stories. People want to gather and tell a story. They love a story. And that's the way we often present things. Do you have thoughts on why we present stories, why we love stories, or do you have any questions, Sush?
Sir, could we say that Moses also narrated God's story or something else?
We could, yes. Then explain further. What would you say in that, Sush?
I'm just asking, sir. Could you say that?
Yeah. I think Moses used storytelling as he presented what unfolded. And so he could have said, just as a matter of fact, we left Egypt, we went to the promised land, but he didn't. He wrote an interesting story. God spoke to me, God spoke to Moses. And when I went to Pharaoh, Pharaoh would not let us go. And then when I left, he let us go. Now, he could write in the first person, God spoke to me, or he could write in the second person, or he could write in the third person, God spoke to Moses. That's looking in. And you and I can write in the first person, second person, or third person as we tell a story. So Moses, like most people, tells a story. Children tell stories. They say, we went and we visited and we faced a difficulty, but we overcome and we came back. So people love to tell a story, and most people would agree that a story is being told in Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, and that Moses wrote and told some story that is in there. Yeah. Any
Yes, sir.
further questions? Yeah.
Yes, sir. I think the creation story has been narrated by Moses, I think. Sir, right?
Yes, yes, yes. In a story, there is also a point of view, which can be the point of view of God, or it can be the point of view of Moses, or it can be the point of view of others. So often there is a point of view. It's going off. All right, we need to stop now. We'll come back in half an hour. If you could read Genesis 37 to 50, and then we'll come back in about 20 to 30 minutes, and we will then have a look further at Joseph and the Joseph narrative. So I will see you